All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Campbell, and I'm here to interview my good friend, KV, co founder of Lighthouse Labs. And we'll bring KV up on the screen here. How you doing, man? How you doing? We'll try that once more time with the audio set up properly.
No problem. Hey, Kyle, KV here. Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, man. Thanks. I really appreciate it. We go way back. I've known you and Jeremy and everyone at Lighthouse Labs for what, almost 6 or 7 years. I was trying to do the math on it the other day. It's been a while,
Pretty much,
right?
pretty much day one since we started. So that would be 2013 when we arrived here in Vancouver to start Lighthouse Labs.
2013. I remember the day. I think it was a Saturday or a holiday or something. As is often the way in startup life, I was working at Launch Academy in downtown Vancouver, and I believe I met Jeremy on his way up the stairs his first day in, and I said to him, "Hey, what do you do?" And he said, "We're starting a coding boot camp. You
That's
want to
right.
hire some developers?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And that's
And you
how
jumped
that's
right
how
on
the
board.
magic started.
Yeah, you did a great job of kind of integrating with Lighthouse Labs. Kind of prime example of how employers should interface with us, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely. And it was huge for us early on with the company Wrestly, which so that's a banner call out here. Because we were really early stage, we didn't necessarily have a lot of investment. We just had some ideas and some passionate people, and we were lucky enough to hire a lot of great people straight out of Lighthouse Labs, including the first cohort. A shout out to Jason Wan out there, one of
yes,
our
absolutely.
best, and so, yeah, I'm really excited to spend some time chatting with you today. Um, we're going to get into things a little bit here. And the goal of this is to really just get a sense of you, who you are. You're one of the what I will call flagship best mentors that I've ever
Oh,
experienced.
that's flattering.
Yeah, I hope
It's
so.
on,
It's
it's on
it's
record now.
it's on record. Yeah. Well, one of the things that we think about a lot at CTO.ai is sort of that exponential impact that somebody can have. We think about it in the context of DevOps, and the 10x developer is one person who can help five people be two times better. But you guys have graduated something like 3,000 people or something in the last couple
That
of
sounds
years. So
right. Yeah,
you're like a
yeah.
10,000x developer or something over there.
Yeah, we definitely leverage the community and mentorship really heavily. So kind of that divide and conquer attitude versus, just having a few full-time teachers, the essentially bottlenecks to being able to have a real impact on the community here. Right? We started 6 years ago, as I mentioned, in Vancouver. We're now across Canada, one of the largest web boot camps in Canada, if not the largest. And as head of education, what I'm proud to say is not really just the size, but also our quality, like the stories that you hear from our students, our grads, going through the program and graduating after the program, and how they kind of progress through their career is just amazing, right? A lot of our students, you mentioned one, who have graduated 5, 6 years ago, are way ahead of me when it comes to software development. Like, this should be mentoring me at this point, right? And that's really awesome to see.
Yeah, that's usually how it works, right? The grasshopper steals the pebble from the hand. So let's
Absolutely.
dig in a little bit before we get too deep into Lighthouse Labs. I want to know about
Yeah,
you, the
absolutely.
man, the myth, the legend. Tell us a little bit about you, your name, age, where do you live, and then let's
Yeah.
get into a little bit of your upbringing. Where did you grow up, and what was your sort of pathway to becoming the astute head of education at Lighthouse Labs?
Wow. Okay, I'll give it a shot. I'm not used to talking in depth about myself, as you know. But my name is Khurram. Virani is my full name, but the staff got tired of trying to pronounce my name, so they just resorted to KV, and it stuck. So I refer to myself as KV now often in the professional world, and definitely my mom and dad don't call me KV. Um, I grew up actually in Karachi, Pakistan, which, for those of you who don't know, has a population of about today probably around 28 million or so. It's not really documented very well, which is approximately the size of Canada in one city. So very, very heavily populated, very dense. But I was very fortunate growing up. I had a computer at a very young age. My dad was essentially always really infatuated by the new emerging technology, and was lucky enough to be able to afford. I think my earliest memory of a computer is a 486, and I was just like playing with MS-DOS and playing a lot of video games, in the MS-DOS world very early on in life, and got also a very enamored by the digital world. This is pre-internet for me, and as you asked my age, I'm 35, so that should put things in perspective. I definitely got to play with my fair share of Ataris and Commodores and all of that as well. And I actually arrived in Canada at the age of 13. So a big chunk of my childhood was actually spent in Karachi, in Pakistan, and definitely give me a very different perspective in terms of life and priorities, and how lucky we are to be in Canada, and how lucky we are to have the kind of education system, healthcare system that we have here. In terms of my childhood, I actually got into teaching other people, adults actually, how to use computers at the age of approximately 8 or 10, when my parents basically volunteered me at a local community center to go teach adults how to use computers, word processing, MS-DOS, programming, things of that nature. And I remember being a mentor along with teenagers at the time, and I wasn't one. And definitely they weren't so happy with me coming in at a very young age, kind of making them look bad, so to speak, right? And I was definitely trying to prove myself in that little community there. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. And I guess I probably didn't realize it at the time, but I was starting to discover my passion for teaching and mentoring, alongside, of course, what I'd already been developing, which is my passion for programming and software development, right? And so that's what kind of started my career as a teacher, perhaps one could argue. It was very young age.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I have a similar story in that I'm also 35 and got a computer early on, and I don't think I was ever in a position where I was teaching adults anything, but that's really inspiring. So, as you went through your teen years, you were both programming and teaching, kind of at the side in these sort of programs, were they, or how were the programs set up? Tell me a little bit more about what these opportunities looked like where you were teaching.
Yeah, so when I came to Canada at the age of 13, grade 8 is when I kind of immersed here. Definitely the first few years were a little rough in terms of being able to integrate with the culture and all of that.
Yeah.
Landed in Burlington, Ontario. For those of you who are based in Canada, you probably recognize that name. And we were there for 2 years, and then Mississauga thereafter. And then eventually I ended up in downtown Toronto for my professional career before coming to Vancouver. But rewinding back to the early days of coming to Canada, I was again lucky that the schooling that I had early on in my high school career or high school time was actually involved computer science, which is still rare today. Actually, it's actually hard to get a good computer science program as a kid in high school. Parents, I think, are looking outside of the traditional kind of track to see, okay, well, are there like centers that my kid can go to in order to, there's English and math centers, but where are the computer science and programming centers? It's very rare to find them. But anyway, I digress. I had a good computer science program, but the teacher wasn't super well versed with the technology that we were learning. We were learning with C++ and Java back in high school, as well as VB6. And I actually helped create some of the curriculum because the teacher was happy to have all the help. So I would be like a week ahead and then do a bunch of readings online and do that kind of stuff, and then put together like a curriculum package for the students. So I was essentially a TA, but not just like mentoring, but also even helping with curriculum. I looked back like a few years later at the stuff I had produced. It was riddled with typos. It was not good pedagogy in any way. But that's also a good sign when you look back at something you've done even a year ago, right? Whether it's code that you've written or anything that you've produced, and you look back and you say, wow, like I could do so much better today. That means you've progressed way more. So I was happy in a way to be able to look back and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so much better at this now than I was back in the high school years. But it was also a really cool opportunity to be able to teach. And I was that kid in computer science who was just like sitting in front of the class, always like got his hand raised, probably annoying the hell out of a whole bunch of the other students. But it was an amazing experience. And I sucked at PE, physical ed. All this stuff, I was the quintessential nerd when it came to my early years. So
yeah, that's awesome. That's a really organic way too of finding yourself into it. But I mean, I want to just drill in real quick on something that you said there, which resonates with me, which is that, coming up through high school, and I'll often talk about the fact that I dropped out of high school, not that I'm proud of it, but it's just to some degree a badge of honor for what came after that, the self-learning that I went through. Absolutely. But I think back, and one of the reasons I loved Lighthouse Labs when I heard about it was, it's something that would have benefited me so much in those earlier years when I was striving for learning and discipline around computer science, but there was very little of it in the curriculum. And now you have all of these sort of like, Code for America and all these different initiatives to try to get coding into the boot camps. But it would be really amazing to have more of these sort of opportunities that can even exist outside of the high schools, where,
I agree.
kids can go to learn. And for me, that was whether it was GeoCities or IRC or Google or just the internet. I was starving and hungry to learn these things. And it sounds like you had the same kind of passion for it, but you also figured out how you could lean into your other passion around teaching in school. And it's cool that you were able to bring those two things together. Do you know, is there many of these programs that exist for high school students nowadays? And like, what do you think the difference is between when you were coming up and now? Do you see it progressing in the same way that self-directed learning and boot camps are emerging on sort of the post-high school era?
I think Canada has made some amazing progress when it comes to computer science education in high school, especially. I would say actually K to 12. There's been some amazing curriculum rework, especially on the BC side, British Columbia, where we reside. Lighthouse Labs was actually involved in helping roll out some massive curriculum changes in BC and then across Canada, where our head instructor here actually flew out to various different cities or even townships in across Canada. I forget the exact number, but it was like 40 different locations or something ridiculous like that. Everything from Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, Hope, like all these interesting areas in BC to train teachers in how to teach computational thinking to students of various ages based on whatever grades they're used to teaching, because of this new curriculum being implemented across Canada and especially in BC. So it was really cool to be involved, less on the curriculum side and more on implementing the change management on how to get teachers bought in and trained up to be able to teach computational thinking. Because for many of them, they're history teachers, they're English teachers, they're music teachers. How do they bring computational thinking into their curriculum? It wasn't just computer science teachers at high schools. And so it's really cool to have that diaspora. In terms of other programs that exist that are outside of the education system, there's a few private programs, but as I alluded to, I don't think there's enough. And most of the adoption or expansion of these private programs has not yet become mainstream in Canada yet. The big one that comes to mind is I think it's a not-for-profit organization. No, it's not. It's actually a for-profit organization. It's a franchise called, I think, Code Ninjas or Coding Ninjas,
Okay.
Which has kind of global reach. But as far as I know, in Canada, they're just starting up. And they're kind of like tuition centers, similar to Kumon, where you can send your kid after school or on weekends, I assume, to learn, instead of learning math and English, they're focusing on programming, programming for kids through game development and languages that make sense to learn programming at that age, not necessarily JavaScript and Ruby, but using things like Scratch, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think it speaks to just, a sign of the times that these things are starting to happen. And I can imagine a world where very soon, just like you have these sort of like sports summer camps that you send your kids to. I mean, I know that there's already ones in the STEM field, but we need to start seeing them emerge around programming and computer science, because, there's another 60 million developers that are meant to come online in the next, 10 years, the way we figure it. And, the internet's going to be a very different place for them than it was when we started. When we started, we were using FTP and with maybe Vim or Emacs on the server, right? Telnet, yeah. And now you've got things like Kubernetes and these distributed systems and, these cloud systems that are emerging, which you have to now be proficient as. I see job postings all the time looking for a front-end developer with experience in Kubernetes. It's the equivalent of a snake trying to swallow an elephant. And I think what's really great about what Lighthouse Labs is you're quickly giving people this like amazing foundation. But there's so much more that also needs to happen for someone even to build up to that. And as I always say, we need to find more mentors. And so whether it's this or it's the podcast that we're doing, we're really trying to create this message around how do we get some of that info out there? How do we get learnings that people can absorb into their own self-directed learning to ramp up? If you were to give some advice to somebody who's, you look back at yourself as a teenager or somebody who's coming into the tech career, what would you say to them as far as like how to build that mentorship model that's so critical for all of us? Because we know that once you get into a job, you can learn a lot. And once you get into Lighthouse Labs or a boot camp and you find other like-minded people, you can learn a lot. But for that person who's sort of pre that, who's sitting out there thinking right now, hey, programming sounds interesting and I like computers, what would you say to them? And how do you think that they should be thinking about mentorship and their learning so that they can find a career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what I'll start with, just for context, is a little bit about Lighthouse Labs and how mentorship ties in there, if that's okay, Kyle, and then I'll go into
Yeah,
answering
that's
your
great.
question.
That's great.
So for those of you who don't know, Lighthouse Labs is, as Kyle alluded to earlier, a coding bootcamp. We have our main program, amongst others, is a 12-week immersive coding education program in person in various locations in Canada, where students spend 12 weeks full time, more than full time actually, going through one subject essentially, which is web development in this case, as opposed to being, more of that traditional education where you're doing a whole bunch of different courses that span STEM and other things. You're focused on one thing. And mentorship is at the core of the learning. So students are here from 9 a.m. till 9 p.m. every day. And yes, there's a little bit of that classroom time where there's lecture in the morning, but a majority of that day, about 8 hours of that day, are spent, or each day during the weekdays is spent working on projects. It's hands-on learning, building projects or small exercises, and like ramping up to larger projects, ramping up to kind of capstone level, final projects that they're able to build full stack web apps, that can do similar things to what we see with Twitter and Facebook and what have you, right? And they're able to do that very quickly, but they come in with very little programming, if any, background. And the reason they're able to accelerate so fast from zero to hero essentially is through mentorship. So that's a core part of our education model. Hands-on learning and mentorship are the two main pieces. And yes, the curriculum is important, and that's one of my bigger focuses here as head of education, is worrying about the curriculum and how it's going to evolve and what are we going to add to our programming. But mentorship is the real reason that they're able to accelerate so quickly. So we have a 15-minute rule. If a student is stuck on something for 15 minutes, especially early on in their time with us, they're asked to quickly request help from a mentor. Or if they finish something and they want to actually get it reviewed, because yes, they have a solution, but is it a good solution? They should leverage mentors who are essentially seasoned developers or graduates of ours who've been in the industry for a few years or a few months, who can relate to the program even better, perhaps, right? And relate to the students a lot. So I think one of the core things that we look at, because we do a lot of mentor training internally as well, we want to make sure that delivery is really good. So when we're training our mentors and when we're hiring mentors, we're looking at one really key attribute that's really important, whether they're alumni or seasoned developers from 10, 15 years of experience. We look for empathy. And I think that's really, really key when you're doing mentorship or when you're thinking about mentorship. And empathy can come in various different ways. For example, alumni really brings a different perspective of, I was here not too long ago. I know what it means to be struggling here with this assignment or with this project. I went through it not long ago. And a senior developer brings a different level of empathy, where they can actually think more in terms of, this is the path that you're going to be taking, and they have their own kind of a longer term journey that they can relate to in terms of when they're having that conversation with the student. And what's really cool is having all these mentors here at Lighthouse Labs is it's not just about like transactional help. It's not just about mentoring. It's just about, let me get you unstuck with whatever problem you're having. You're having an error message. Let me help you get past it. Yes, that's often the reason for starting a conversation, but I like my favorite mentors are the ones that use that as a way of, as a teaching tool to talk about approach, right? They're not here to learn React or Ruby on Rails or Node or JavaScript, even, I would argue. They're here to learn how to learn at a high level, but more importantly, kind of at a practical level, they're here to learn how to debug, how to think strategically in terms of learning new things, using incremental development and error-based like development, where you get comfortable with errors versus getting scared of them. Those kind of philosophies really permeate through our mentorship program and allow kind of essentially reprogramming of our students. One of the things I noticed right off the bat with emerging developers, people that are learning software development for the first time, is our society has programmed us to think about errors as a very negative thing. If something bad happens on the computer and we've caused it, we are programmed to think that we did something wrong and that we shouldn't do that anymore. But actually, if you think about software development, Kyle, and how you've been coding for the past 15 odd years, is you actually probably, my guess is, you use errors to your advantage.
Oh yeah.
Right. And similar to me, like we are not scared to see an error. We're not scared to hit enter or run on the computer to see what the code actually does. And we actually take it a step further where we have a hypothesis created beforehand where we go, I think the code will do this, right? So my goal is to take them from being afraid of errors to not being afraid of them to actually championing them and using them as part of their development process. Now, there's terms that senior developers use in the community like TDD or test-driven development, but I actually take it, I take the testing part out of that initially because it's too much to begin with. And I call it error-driven development, something that's not really talked about in the industry, where we actually use errors. And if you think about TDD, sorry to get a little technical on you.
No,
the core part of that is actually error-driven development, which is you work incrementally, you work in small steps, and you actually cause errors intentionally, and then you fix them. Now, with TDD, we use tests to drive that, but we don't have to use tests to drive that. And I actually use that from our very first day to actually retrain our students to think in terms of errors and not think in terms of, oh yeah, I'm always going to see success and everything's going to work great. Whether you're a new software developer or somebody who's a senior developer, you're going to see errors the entire time, and you're actually going to want to use them to progress through whatever you're building. So that's kind of one of the core things that I look at in terms of mentorship is kind of reprogramming students to think positively with errors versus negatively. And then, of course, a lot of it is to help them get unstuck with whatever they're doing so that they have more aha moments, essentially, in the day. I remember in university, things are a lot more relaxed. Yes, you have your crunch time when it comes to exams and things, but I spent a lot of time playing World of Warcraft and Counter-Strike in my university years. You don't have that luxury here in boot camp. And because you don't have that, you actually spend a lot of the time having more aha moments. Whereas in university, let's say you have a few aha moments a day or a week where you actually understand something and you've adjusted your mental model of how something works. Here at Lighthouse Labs, it happens multiple times a day, multiple times an hour.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of goal of this condensed and immersive education, is to really accelerate that, and mentorship's kind of at the core of it. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you definitely did. You definitely did. I mean, what I will call out there a little bit, I mean, to unpack that is a lot, but for those who are kind of pre-Lighthouse Labs, maybe you're in high school, you're kind of trying to figure out how you can go about learning programming. One of the things I would say is a natural extension into something like a boot camp is just getting your feet wet with things like open source. Get out there and just find a project on GitHub or, has a pull request. Or the way I learned is I used GeoCities. Remember GeoCities way back in the day? You had like the visual editor, and then I'd go in and I'd try to figure out what the code did. And to your point, I would just do something, it would fail, and then I'd undo it, and I'd do something else.
Don't be afraid to break things is a big important takeaway that, our education system still doesn't teach that very well.
Yeah. I think failure is an implicit part of learning, and you described it as sort of error-driven development. I thought about it in a lower level construct that's very similar, and this is the first time that we've gotten this deep on it, so I'm actually really glad to hear you talk about it like this. But what I've always communicated to your grads when they come in to work with me at our company is kind of not just an extension of the engineering mindset of test-driven development or error-driven development. It's almost an extension of the entrepreneurial side of me as well, which I find these two things merge. And I've just simply explained it to people as confidence. I'm looking for you to establish confidence as quickly as possible. And that means you're not afraid to try something and fail. It also means you won't spend 3 weeks trying to figure it out at the cost of everyone else around you who could support you and unblock you in, maybe 15 minutes to your point. But at the end of the day, I want you to have confidence that it's okay to try something and fail. And your goal should be to maximize those iteration loops where you can get mentorship injected into them as rapidly as possible. And that can be really hard until you move into some sort of, community, we'll call it, for learning. And that can happen sort of in open source. But what I think is really great about boot camp and Lighthouse Labs in particular, which I wish had been around for me, is that it gives you just enough formal structure to really maximize those iteration loops and help you to build confidence in your domain. And I think it took me 6 years, even once I got into the job force, because, I'd find a little bit of mentorship from somebody here and a little bit of mentorship from somebody here, but there wasn't that sustained sort of objective, voice of, Kyle, you're doing it wrong. So I could, think about how to do it differently. And had I done that, probably I could have learned in 6 weeks what I learned in 6 years at a place like at Lighthouse Labs.
Yeah, thank you. I call it just-in-time learning.
There you go.
It is a thing that's actually a term, so I didn't invent that term, but essentially using that to define what we do here, which is, you are learning the things that are going to be really important for the next step and are going to be important for the career that you're looking to actually get into, versus, again, traditional education, which, I have no problem with at a high level, but one of the problems with it in the computer science side of things is this focus on theoreticals, which is very valuable, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But spending 4 years on that, I found I didn't use much of that coming out of university. I had learned very little web development. I had learned very little about software engineering, what it means to work in a team, how to actually do sprint planning, things of that nature that are a part of the holistic developer, essentially, versus just, being able to write algorithms, which for the most part is valuable, but for the most part is not what you do on a day-to-day basis, at least in the web development side of things, right?
Yeah.
And so what we teach is a lot more of the practical stuff. And that time constraint of 12 weeks really kind of focuses us to teach the things that are relevant, and also building blocks versus too much upfront learning. We always tell our students that, the path to becoming a software developer is 6 to 12 months, even though our program is 3 months. And it's just the launching pad towards that next step. You talk to anybody who's been doing this for a few years and you ask them, how did you get so good? Where did you learn all the neat tricks that you know about software development? They're not going to say Lighthouse Labs after a few years. They're not going to say University of Waterloo or U of T or whatever university or school system that they went through. They're going to say, I learned on the job. I learned by doing. Yeah. And so our goal, my kind of philosophy with education is to get you to that as soon as possible, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I mean, that's probably a great segue to kind of one of the reasons, one of the things I want to talk about next, which is what needs to happen at a company in order to help those engineers be successful, and what kind of support needs to be put in place. You use this term just-in-time learning. So I've been, using this term quite a lot lately, just-in-time DevOps, which, the term DevOps gets thrown around a lot, but let me just frame how I think about DevOps. DevOps isn't the idea of provisioning a server necessarily, as it is the entire developer experience. It is all the things you need to put in place as a company to help your developers be successful. And I think one of the things that I realized very much when I started hiring people at a Lighthouse Labs, and I think I've probably, directly or indirectly contributed to maybe 40 or 50 different people at a Lighthouse Labs getting hired into different startups. I've seen a lot of what goes on in a company and what needs to go on in a company to help that developer bridge into that work experience and find enough mentorship, but also enough open area to iterate and try things. Where I really like to focus on this idea for a minute of, there's sort of an individual's learning curve, right? And we talked a lot about that and how they find their path. And, maybe they come out of Lighthouse Labs and they don't necessarily have the fundamentals of DNS figured out just yet, but that's something that they're going to figure out on the job from someone else who's been through that, right? Mm-hmm. But then what's very interesting about this is also a company's learning curve. And what we started to think a lot about is the adoption of developer operations practices that act on a curve. And we think of it as, if on one hand you sort of have the things you need to implement, and then the other hand you have time, and you have a startup growing through to Fortune 100 company, you start out with things like source control, and then you move into things like deployment management, and then infrastructure provisioning, incident management, logging, observability, and governance is kind of where you end up. There's a place on this curve where I think companies are way better and way more suited to support emerging talent. And in my opinion, that is often in the earlier stages. Maybe not the earliest stage, because then there's a lack of mentors. But let's say that seed to Series A stage in a startup, where an engineer who's coming into the workforce can get a lot of opportunities that they wouldn't get in a larger company. But what do you think about that? Where do you see companies being really successful at hiring grads? Where do you see them maybe having challenges? And what are the things that, beyond just having a willingness to mentor, what are the things you think that they need to put into place to help them be successful when they're hiring junior engineers or engineers who are just entering the workforce?
Absolutely. So I think using you and your history with Lighthouse Labs is a great example, because you were part of our recipe, essentially, in terms of what makes a good employer, right? You were actually you were integrated into our education versus just waiting at the end saying, okay, can I hire your graduates? You actually did guest lectures with us. You were actually even in some of our core lectures where you came in and we lectured together. And so you actually had some connection with the students before they even graduated, right? And you had some insight into them as well. You came in and you mentored for some of the cohorts as well. And that allowed you to kind of almost do interview processes without even you realizing it and them realizing it. I talked about community-driven education as a core pillar of ours, which is where mentorship comes in. Most of our mentors actually are employers of ours. They end up either referring our students somewhere or directly hiring them for their own startups, their own companies, because that's a great way to build that community, right? So we believe in developers out there teaching with us part-time and then using that to their advantage. And why not, right? And it's a win-win situation versus a win-lose or a lose-lose situation. But in terms of other ways that companies, so that's one way, like startups or large companies sending their talent that's interested in mentoring and coaching or interested in getting better at it to Lighthouse Labs to become better at mentoring. We even run workshops for people who are intermediate to senior level developers who are actually looking to level up as mentors within their companies or within their institutions.
It makes tons of sense. Just to interrupt you real quick, like if you're going to use open source, you give back to open source. It's kind of the same model within this sort of hiring model forward. Here. Exactly. Is that if you can get engaged and you can actually, understand the problems that people are facing and support them with growing into their career, you're going to have a way more engaged student base for what you're offering, which is employment, but you're also going to be more successful at helping them to bridge into your company once you've built a little bit of rapport, right?
And none of this is rocket science. It's stuff that we did naturally before Lighthouse Labs. Before I started Lighthouse Labs, I had another company called Functional Imperative, which was a consultancy.
Right.
You know about this, Kyle.
Yes.
And we hired other bootcamp grads, we hired college grads, we hired university grads for junior talent. And we were good at leveling them up in our organization. And we just looked at how we were doing that. Within 6 to 12 months of somebody joining us as a early developer, as somebody who's just graduated university or college or another bootcamp, and Lighthouse Labs eventually, once we started that, they within 6 to 12 months, they were actually coaching other juniors coming into the team, right? So I think mentorship actually it needs to be at every role at every level. It's just it's about how much. It's not a 0-1. It's not binary. It's about how you're doing mentorship and how much you're doing it. So the earlier on you can get somebody in their career thinking like a mentor, thinking like a coach, the better. Because one of the reasons that teachers, our software developers, do come to us to teach is because they know one of the best ways to learn is to teach. You really start to realize the limits of your knowledge when somebody's having an issue that you've never seen before. Yeah. Because our journey is just, we have blindfolds on essentially. We don't know what other people are experiencing. But as soon as we start coaching and mentoring, it actually becomes a much more well-rounded team. And then there's the whole soft skills side. I know that term is kind of conflated, but the definition of intermediate senior developer is often just described as years with a certain technology or a certain language, but I think actually it's a lot about responsibility and holistic thinking, like thinking strategically in terms of architecture, in terms of software design, in terms of, as you said, DevOps. How does a team actually function? How do they operate? How do they interact with infrastructure people? How do they actually think about infrastructure while they're writing code? One of the lectures I do here near the end of the program is talking about DevOps with the students and how, albeit it's a conflated term that can mean two completely different things.
It's very frightening.
One of the things it really means is developer operations, like how developers operate, right? And so one of the things I show them is, look, we're going to talk about scaling and infrastructure, things like Docker and things like virtual, cloud hosting and DNS and content delivery networks and scaling, like horizontal versus vertical scaling. And I'll show you actually the premise of that lecture is to introduce them to the concept of DevOps, but also to get them excited about a completely different and more important way of thinking about developers, which is like a lot more holistic. If you don't understand how your code is going to run in the cloud or wherever it's running, you will actually write code that does not work. So a big part of DevOps is actually that holistic thinking about how is this actually going to run? Oh, I have like 6 servers running this. When I deploy this change, I have to think about how that's going to affect users in terms of how is it going to get deployed across those servers? Is it going to be all together? Is it going to break things as it happens? So the main premise of that lecture is really thinking like a senior dev to give them that lens into what you have to think about, and also from a DevOps perspective, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I would even go one step farther in DevOps. You really have a responsibility to think about how the other developers are going to use whatever you create, because a lot of time you are
Exactly.
building the tools that they interface with and now you have a stake in their success. And, we have this little hashtag DevOps heroes that we sort of throw out there because I think it doesn't always get a lot of love, but whether it's mentorship or just, the hard facts of here's how we build the tools that a developer uses to do their day-to-day work, whether it's deployment or provisioning or any of these really complex tasks which could take a lot of time out of their day. I think there's specifically a responsibility, especially as you get into those senior levels. And to just touch on what you said about sort of the different sort of roles, I think of it as like a junior engineer is someone who needs a lot of mentorship, and that's totally okay. An intermediate is someone who is pretty self-sufficient but isn't yet mentoring others. A senior engineer is somebody who's mentoring others and responsible for working on their own holistic tasks. But then a DevOps engineer is somebody who then pairs that mentoring with tools that they can inject into the experience layer of other people's work to help them be more proficient. So beyond them just saying, hey, here's how you can set those servers up, they are actually saying, here's some tools so you can do it yourself. And there's this sort of teach yourself the fish model that exists the whole way through, but then the tactics just kind of evolve. And I think once you sort of bridge past that senior engineer role and you realize, hey, now I can start to be a platform for other people's success, that is really the idea of, in my mind, success for an engineer is that they're now having that second order impact on those around them, whether it's through mentorship, but also through tooling that they can offer. And I think these things kind of need to go hand in hand. And, whether it's startups or companies out there, I think we need to encourage them to invest into both within their company and externally. So just want to kind of try and tie this off a little bit, this thought. I mean, we talked a little bit about what needs to be successful or what a company might need to do to help us engineer to be successful. What are the things that you're seeing that they're doing that just really aren't helping? The things that are like almost guaranteeing a failure of somebody hiring at a Lighthouse Labs? Are there any like just clear, because we said earlier, we started this conversation with like our errors are the things that, help us to learn. What's something that if a company is coming to Lighthouse Labs for the first time and they're thinking, hey, I want to try this, what's the number one thing that they shouldn't do if they want to be successful with hiring
I
new
like that
grads?
question. I like that question a lot. And it does happen, right? It's not a perfect world out there. Things that I've seen companies do that don't really work when it comes to hiring our grads or grads in general. Isolate them, right? Don't provide mentorship, and provide no senior support. So hire a junior developer when you don't have a senior either part-time or full-time on the team, or you have a senior on the team who literally is not a good mentor, has not received coaching, and will sometimes be hostile and say things like, well, this, you should know this, or, why are you coming to me with this? There's definitely a mentorship culture that needs to be built in the company early on. And when you're talking about hiring the right senior developers at a startup, especially when you're setting the culture and the tone, you really need to think about not just their dev capabilities, but their ability to work within a team and coach others, whether they're other senior developers or other junior developers. So not having the mentorship culture is the biggest killer, I think, in terms of scaling a team. It's not just about hiring junior devs. You're going to struggle to hire any kind of real productive team. So I think mentorship is not just about juniors. It's really about productivity of the team.
Yeah,
right?
That's definitely something for engineers to look out for too, as they're coming into the workforce and they're interviewing with companies. One of the things, having interviewed, maybe 100 different Lighthouse Labs, I always get the same question, which is, definitely about that. And I would expect that that's part of the coaching that you guys offer, which I think is really great, is for the engineer who's coming into a new company to ask, how much mentorship am I going to get? But one of the things I always try to encourage those people to ask is also ask, what are the kind of things I'm going to get to work on and who's going to be there to support me? Because I think framing it in that context lets you evaluate two things. And the two things that I would think you would want to, really evaluate as you're looking for new opportunities: where am I going to get to work on things that are going to be challenging to me, that maybe are outside of my comfort zone that are going to advance my learning? But then what kind of safety net do I have if I am not able to figure it out on my own?
Right.
And that's something that I think where you find the perfect opportunity in a mid-stage startup, because you're both going to be able to do things that you wouldn't be able to do in a large company just because rules and structure, but you're also hopefully going to have enough passionate senior engineers to support you.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Other things that I've seen companies do not well as a result, and that resulting in them struggling with scaling their team, is not setting aside time for especially junior developers, but developers of all levels, to actually experiment and learn new things outside of whatever they're using to build the tools that they're building at work. If they want to get a little bit more into DevOps and learn a little bit more about infrastructure and automation of that, but it's not necessary in their current role, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put aside a half day or put some interesting hackathon together within the company, or lunch and learns where seniors who do know how to do that are actually teaching the newcomers who are interested in that to sit in and kind of learn about what they do and how it works. I think they should think about developer growth versus just team growth, because developer growth leads to team growth. And that's something I see some companies not doing well and then struggling as a result.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, KV, thanks so much for doing this, man. I want to thank you for putting your time in today to share these thoughts. I think it's going to be really helpful for engineers, but also companies. And it's great to hear a bit more about your journey. Thank you also for putting time forward yourself, and also Charlene with our new podcast, the If Else podcast, hosted by Mayuko. Shout out. We've got a new episode dropping on Monday, which is React versus Vue, where we've got some really awesome guests who are going to discuss the differences between the two frameworks to help people make an if-else decision. And as always, thank you so much for your time. If people want to know more about what's going on at Lighthouse Labs, if they want to be able to apply to get into your interview process to become a student, what should they know? Where should they go?
Well, they definitely have to just call me. That's the only way. No, I'm kidding. The best way is to go online, check out our website, lighthouselabs.ca. It gives all the information about all our programs. I focused on the Web Bootcamp, but we actually have part-time programs to help people skill up versus reskill. And they can definitely learn about our part-time courses and take those courses while they're doing whatever jobs that they're currently at, and hopefully bring code and data skills back to their work. So that's the best way, lighthouselabs.ca, and you can apply online as well. We're working on very interesting initiatives. It's not just about coding bootcamp, right? As I mentioned earlier, we work with government as well, and we work with corporations, companies, to help run workshops and run our programming with their teams as well. So if there's a corporate training initiative that we're also focused on here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, and everybody check out Lighthouse Labs, lighthouselabs.ca. Thanks, KB.
Thanks, Kyle. Really appreciate the time. Cheers.